I know it's going to be good, going to be great. We'll start off with a little talk about who was here first. And of course, the natives were here as early as about 5,500 years ago. There's dig sites along the beaches, and there are pit mounds and things like that, foundations of some of their houses they had. By the time the first settlers came up here, they were in decline. They picked up diseases from traders and from other tribes they had traded with. And so they'd already lost about 20 to 25% of their population here. When Vancouver came in and explored, they found a lot of empty villages, including here. The Nooksack tribe had declined in population. Originally, I believe they had about 8 large villages, and they only had like 5 here when he came, somewhat like that. And so there was lots of opportunity here for the Europeans to come in and kind of do some taking of the resources. And they did this in a number of ways, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The first Europeans to have visited the shores of Washington State and the entrance to the Sound was supposed to be a man by the name of John Focus. Now, we all know him by a different name, John de Fuca, Juan de Fuca, okay? He was a Greek. He was born on Kefalonia Island in the Aegean Sea in 1536. He went to work for the Spanish Navy, and then, of course, he was involved as a navigator. Now, they had a pilot and navigator on the ships who ran the ship, and they also had a military officer to control the men, the crew. And they were in charge of the crew, but not the ship. The pilot was the ship's master, and that's what he did for many years. He made 2 trips up the coast. The first one, it was under military control, and he didn't do much there, but they made it as far north as Oregon, and then they had to turn around and go back to Mexico because there was a mutiny that was on the ship. You have to remember, being in the Navy or in the Maritimes in those days was a pretty bad job. It was like being a slave only on a ship. So they had scurvy. They didn't know about having oranges and things like that to eat or making bark tea. And so they turned around and went back. On his second trip, later that year, he came up and he entered the Straits of Anon, what he declared to be the Straits of Anon, and is what we call today the Straits of Juan de Fuca. He told other people about it, and anyhow, he went back to Greece and he died in, what is it here, 1602, okay. And he went back to Kefalonia and lived out his life there, probably pretty well-to-do, being that he was a ship's master. So when Barclay Sound, he came in 1787, and he re-entered the Straits, and he realized that he was in an area that had been described for many years by Juan de Fuca, and so that's who he named it after. A lot of conjecture about whether that was real or not. One of the things Juan de Fuca talked about was the pillar at the entrance to the Straits. There's your pillar, that big blocky thing. It's still there today. This is a recent picture. For many years, they thought he was a fictional character. I don't know. But it's been determined now that everything he did and said was true. Another gentleman that came in here later, after Vancouver had explored the upper and lower Puget Sounds, the next person that came in was Charles Wilkes, who was leading an expedition in 1838 to 1841 all over the country, both shores of the Americas, and then clear over into the South Pacific Islands and whatnot, up the coast into Alaska. And he was the leader of this expedition. There were several ships. And he came into Bellingham Bay. They took samples of the wildlife and vegetation and some rock samples and things like that. So he came here in 1841. One of the ships was the Peacock, and if you go down to the museum in Astoria, you'll see the keel of that ship in that museum. It was wrecked on the sandbar down there. And then they had to board another ship. And a junior officer who was also a surveyor by the name of James Alden was with that expedition. We're going to move forward to 1843 when this fort was built over on Vancouver Island. It's Fort Victoria. And the Hudson Bay chose that point because they had doing all their trapping and other activity up here. So they basically abandoned Fort Vancouver and moved on up into this area. Another reason was to establish ownership of Vancouver Island because they knew eventually they were going to have to give all of Washington up. And they did. They maintained control. At one point, there's a legend that says they came into Bellingham Bay and looked at that pretty closely too, but they went with the island. Now, Vancouver Island probably had 300 Hudson Bay Company people at it in 1852 when the first settlers came into Bellingham Bay. They were mostly fur trappers and their assistants. They didn't have any form of government outside of their own jurisdiction. And that kind of stayed that way for many years. During the gold rush in 1858, approximately 50,000 people entered the straits, came in. Most of them went to Victoria. And by 1856, the fort was dismantled because the city was already many times larger than the fort was. In fact, they were the second largest city on the West Coast. The fort was dismantled in 1864. Meanwhile, on this side of the water, this is Henry Roeder. Now Henry, he came from Ohio. He lived on the Great Lakes. He was a ship's captain on the lakes there when he was in his early 20s. And he came over in 1853 to work in the California gold fields. And he got sick, he got cholera, and he was sick for quite a while. And meanwhile, he had met up with Russell Peabody, and they became partners, and they started fishing salmon in the Sacramento River and selling it to the miners. And then they had a salting thing where they filled barrels of salmon and salted it and sold it. And so then they also ran a general store and did some other things too. And then they decided, well, we've been here long enough, we'll move north. And they came north, and they got into Olympia, and they said, what's here to do? Well, there's logs, there's timber. Everywhere you looked was trees. So they decided to open a sawmill, because what had happened was San Francisco had burned down for about the 10th time in 5 years. There were approximately 40,000 people living there at the time, so that was quite a large city. It was the largest one on the coast. And so they decided to build a sawmill, which they did. They came in December of 1852, along with several other Europeans in a boat that was in a large ocean-going canoe that was paddled by the Lummies. And so they brought them here. They landed on the beach. Roeder then goes back to San Francisco to get equipment for a sawmill. Peabody stays, and along with Indian help, they build the mill. Then by the middle of 1853, there's probably a couple dozen European settlers here. They're mostly men. And so they build, they're out cruising for timber, two of them, and they find a coal seam on the Seaholm side about the foot of Railroad Avenue, if you went down to the water level at that point. And they opened that up, and that became the Seaholm coal mine. And so by just a few years later, within a few years, there were more people living in Seaholm than there was Whatcom. There were about 100 men worked in the coal mine. It paid in gold, bullion. So, of course, that was a pretty good job back then. They made about $50 a month, too, in 1855. That's pretty good money. So in the lower part of the picture here, You got the mill office. Now the mill office sat up where the post office is today, right next to the gully where the Whatcom Falls is. And they ran a sluice from the upper edge of the creek over to the mill, and then, of course, it went down into the mill to operate the saw, to drive the saw. In 1853, all of these early settlers were able to take donation claims. Each man got 160 acres, and if he was married and had his wife with him, they got 320 acres. All except for Alonzo Poe, who lived down here where Fairhaven is today. He got 320 acres because he had arrived in Washington Territory before they passed the last donation claim laws. You can see the dates on this: 1852, 1854, 1853, 1853. Now the dates indicate when the first settlers came. It has nothing to do with the age of the town. This is a map put out by the county. You can see the original sizes of the cities, and then of course the partial outline of what it was in 1890. It just grew by leaps. In 1891, the first railroads came here. By the end of the year, we had 4 international railroads in Bellingham, or on the bay. Here's James Alden. He ended up being a Commodore in the Navy, commander during Civil War. And he surveyed here until about 1860. He was here in 1854. He did some drawings of the area. They did a lot of survey work. They were up and down. His ship was the Active. It was a steamer, and it participated in the Battle of Seattle in 1856, or 5, late fall. 5, and that was when the Indians attacked the town, and the Active and another ship drove off the natives with their cannon fire. The natives pretty well got scared and ran away. So this was a ship that was up here. It went up into Bering Sea and went clear down into Valparaiso, Chile, and back and forth doing surveys of the whole west coast. This is the survey of Bellingham Bay. It has a date of 1855 on it, but actually I think it was done in 1854. There's the mouth of the Squalicum Creek, a few houses there. Now this is all Eldridge's land on the west side of the creek, his donation claim. He had 360 acres. So then you had the west boundary and the east boundary of Roeder's claim. And then Peabody was on the corner here. And then this side was taken up by the people who ran the Bellingham coal mine. That Fitzhugh or Fitzpatrick or one of those two, they took the claim here. Paddle, he took a claim here because he had found another coal seam earlier. And then Vale and all the people that were on this end, they were actually working under the control of Paddle, who wanted all that land for his coal. And then later on, that all ended up in the Bellingham Bay Seahome Coal Mine Company property. This map was done by William McMultry, who was a partner of Alden's. And you'll see a map, sometimes it will be this map, and it will show the Colony Dock and a bunch of other features because it was updated in 1890s. This is one of Alden's drawings. It's of Whatcom. It was done in 1854. Big city here. And then he did another picture a little further away, but it shows these buildings in the background. And outside of one other building on that side of the creek, there isn't much going on. This was pretty well wooded, which I'm not too sure about because other pictures don't show that many trees. And the forest fires had ravaged this area for hundreds of years, so I'm not sure what they were looking at here. This is on the west or the east side of the bay. Mount Baker, the bluffs along the shoreline below the Seahome coal mine. There's the town of Seahome right there. So it was done the same year. This might have been done by McMultry too. Here's the mill. can see the sloop back here, and then on this side is where those buildings were, in behind where the mill is drawn in, and then there's another building here. It didn't show too many buildings here. And then there were more buildings on the other side of the point there. This is the sawmill. Now, the only problem with this is it was up against the bluff a little further because it had to take advantage of that mill race that came off the top of the hill, off the top of the falls, that went into the wheel to drive it. Otherwise, it's pretty well indicated. Here's the walkway that went across the mouth of the creek. And then, of course, there was another path that went up. This was the only way to get from one side of the creek to the other, unless you went all the way over to what is today F Street, went up to the top of the bluff, and then crossed over. There was later on in 1858, there was another bridge up there. In 1876, this footbridge burned or was washed out. And the paper is full of things like, get the bridge fixed, get the bridge fixed. Because people would then have to crawl up the bluff and go across on the old picket bridge and come back down. Here he is, my hero, George Pickett. I say that because he was quite a fascinating character. He graduated last in his class at West Point. And he was pretty much a gung-ho guy when it came to fighting. And so he was awarded some awards in Mexico during the battle with Mexico. And he got the choice, I guess, plum job of coming here in 1856 with 68 soldiers and building Fort Bellingham and building a road from Fort Bellingham to Fort Steilacoom, which he did not accomplish. They didn't give him nearly enough money. He also, of course, later on joined the Confederacy, which is kind of a strike against him, but then he did okay there too. He didn't lose the Pickett's charge. It was just a failure from the start. We can talk about that a little bit. But he was the major employer for the town of Whatcom for several years. And even when they went over to the pig war site on San Juan Island, they still bought most of their stuff from Warbus, who was the sutler here. The sutler was a person who kind of ran the store for the fort. Here's a drawing of Fort Bellingham. It was 208 feet on a side. The walls were about 12 to 14 feet high and built out of just slab boards, cedar. So I was here on the bluff, overlooking the bluff. The reason they picked this place was because it was the only clearing on the bluff that had fresh water available. They actually ran off the people who took the donation claim here and didn't give it back to him until the late 1860s. Now he left here in 59 to go over to San Juan Island. They took one of the blockhouses and most of the wall with them. And then, so the only thing that was left here was part of the stockade wall and the sutler's headquarters and store. And then later on that became a stock pen for cattle, and then the building was used for storing things like hay and wood pieces and stuff. In 1890s, that was burnt down because of another forest fire. There's also a story that says it was burned by a hobo who set fire in it to get warm. Pickett lived in this house. I don't know, maybe there's no indication that he built it, really. It's a lot of local old history says, well, he built the building, but we're not sure about that. There's some question. But he had a son here and a wife. Yeah, they lived here. And this was just up the hill, of course, from the brick courthouse, so we'll talk about that here in a bit. In June of 1858, one of the surveyor engineers drew this drawing of the town of Whatcom. Now, in May of 1858, the first miners came here. They were going to go on the Fraser River Gold Rush. And they were, like I say, I've seen numbers as high as 70,000 that came up to the northwest and were waiting for the trail to open from Vancouver Island, from Semiahmoo, from here, from a lot of other towns on the bay, on the Sound, to go up the river. One of the problems they had was they couldn't take boats up the river because the water was too high. And that didn't happen until August, which was about the end of the whole thing. You can see the buildings along the bluff. There's a reason why they're tied up to the bluff. It's because the high water line is here. This would be like Holly Street and Astor Street. Here's Pickett's house. We're not sure what it has on the top. Somebody said that's like he could climb up there and look over and see the fort, but I don't think that was really true because of all the trees in the way. The mouth of the creek is over here. The bay came around and it went inland to the mouth of the creek. It left a quite large bay. An outlet was quite large. Not like it is today. I mean, this would be Holly Street. You've got, what, another quarter mile or so before you get to water. Around 1995, they sluiced the hill down and they made a kind of a slope there where you could actually get up and down anywhere along that area. Another thing that was going on in 1858 was the survey for the border between the United States and Great Britain. In early 1858, it wasn't Canada, it wasn't anything, it was called Rupert's Land. So it all belonged to the Hudson Bay Company. This boulder's still there. It's at Birch Point. If you go out to the Semiahmoo Spit and go walking south along the beach, you will come to it. And it has a carving in it that says U.S. Coast Survey, USCS, 1858. In 1859, this drawing was done of Seaholm, the town of Seaholm. You can see somebody's gone to great lengths to help us out with identifying the buildings here. His name was George Pickett. He drew this picture. There's a copy of the original in the Pickett house. Here's George Pickett. Now you want to know about the charge at Gettysburg. If you can read that, it says, "Even now I can hear them cheering as I gave the order forward. I can feel the thrill of their joyous voices as they called out all along the line. We'll follow you, Marsh George. Oh, how faithfully they kept the word, following me on and on to their death. And I, believing in the promised support, led them on, oh God." He was not in the rear area. He was about 2/3 of the way across the field. We just went there last September. It's a mile from the Seminary Ridge to Cemetery Ridge. And one of the things that happens is 2 hours before the charge, the Confederates unleashed their 180th cannon at the Union lines, and most of the shots didn't hit anything. So when he started his charge, 165 cannon from the Union side decimated his army. He started out with 12,500 soldiers, and he ended up with 4,500. I'm standing. I would have him coming right at me. This is the wall right here. It's kind of sunk down. And they got to the wall. About 18 of them came over the wall and had to surrender. Half of their men had already turned back, the ones that were still upright. This picture was taken sometime after the mill burned. The mill burned, this is 1874. It burned on August 22nd, 1873. The flames from the fire could be seen on Samish Island. And it was quite a sight. All the townsmen turned out to fight the fire because it was starting to spread. It spread over to the Whatcom house, which was next to the brick building. And so they spent most of the night fighting the fire and managed to get it out. William Utter was running the mill at the time, and him and some Indian helpers managed to move most of the cut lumber away from the fire. The mill sat right on this. This is the ruins of the mill here. That's actually the charred remains of it. Here's that footbridge I was talking about. And then the creek comes up, it goes up to the top of the ridge. This is a close-up, and you can see the charred remains. And then here's that mill race. Now the water, they had a dam at the top of the creek to back up the water. You can see that's all burned off and gone. However, this is the bridge in 1920. It's still got the weir up, and there was a big lake where the city hall sits. That was all underwater there. It was clear back into east of the present-day freeway. And so here's their diverter pipe that went to the colony mill, which was built on the same location 20 years later. There was no mill built for that 20 years because Roeder and Peabody had formed a partnership. Peabody died in 1867 in California, leaving behind two families, one on the East Coast and one here. And they fought between one another for about almost 20 years. And Peabody's brother finally settled the accounts, and then everything was fine. Then Roeder could get his property back to build on it. 1873 or 4. It's hard to tell. There's a picture in the museum has 1873 on it. The one I have says 1874. Okay, these are the buildings that were here in 1874. It would have looked just like this in 1858 when it was built. This is the courthouse. This is the Whatcom Hotel. The creek is way over here, so you can see the cinders were blowing over here during the fire of the mill. This was the Northern Light newspaper office, which was built by another settler here and rented by him. When the guy left town in the fall of 1858, he left the press behind. So the press was taken over to Port Townsend and used there for their newspaper. The other buildings I'm not sure about. Here's Pickett's house. This was taken from the corner of Chestnut and Cornwall, where it is today. So this picture was drawn in 1883 by another surveyor. Here's the building. Here's the hotel. It's torn down in 1920. And so here's the rest, the Division Street part of Whatcom. And then here's the Colony Mill. It's just been built, 1883. And it's sitting right on the same location as the other mill was. Now, if you look at this picture, you'll see the side of this building is being held up by boards. Well, it was the same thing on the other picture. Even as late as 1874, they had already had to make repairs. The tide came right up underneath the building, and it started washing the support wall away. So they had to put a berm in. And then, of course, there was still more damage to the bricks because the mortar wasn't very good, didn't hold very well. And so they had to kind of hold up the wall. And then there was, later on, the back wall started to deteriorate, so they had to put boards up to hold that up. The interior floor was sitting on pilings, and that started rotting away, and they had to replace that several times. So by 1888, when they decided they'd spent about $50,000 on this building, it only cost them about $2,500 in 1863 when they bought it for a courthouse. They paid $50,000 to repair it and turned around and sold it to the JIR Women's Auxiliary for $811 or something like that. Yeah. Not only that, but the gentleman who did the Bellingham Bay Mail from 1873 to 1878, newspaper downstairs in the jail part, he only paid $1 a month rent. Pretty good. Here's the town of Seaholm, and this says 1888. The picture was taken. It was when the picture was copyrighted by a newspaper. But the picture actually dates from 1884. The St. Louis Hotel. Here's the Seaholm Hotel. Here's Morse Hardware, just this side of the St. Louis Hotel. Here's the mine office. The coal mine was right down along the bluff here. And then you had this first Seaholm School here, built in 1863. Now the school, it was torn down in about 1905, somewhere between 1895 and 1905 when they ran Maple Street through over to Cornwall. Cornwall at that time was called Dock Street. This is Elk Street. It was platted originally as Main Street, and then of course it became Elk Street. Main Street was just too, I don't know, kind of like everybody had a Main Street, right? Or a front street. So this was named Elk Street later on in a later plat. Seaholm was platted during the gold rush in May of 1858, and Whatcom was planted on the the plat was signed off on the 4th of July in 1858. Parts of both plats are still in use today, but the names have all changed, of course. All the streets in Whatcom were numbered and lettered. So you see there's been some major changes just in that. This is the town of Whatcom in 1883, and it's taken from the Colony Mill. Here's the Colony Mill. Here's the Colony Dock. It went out a mile, and they did that because it was about maybe 6 to 12 feet deep for the first 3/4 of a mile out in the bay. When they platted Whatcom, 13th Street is the one that was next to the water, and so you had streets 1 through 12 out in the bay on the mud flats. During the gold rush, the miners actually drove pilings out there and tied rafts to it and put the tents on the rafts. So they could walk on low tide, they could walk ashore. Here's the old courthouse building here. Here's the Phelps block. They just finished building this, and it's going to have, well, Phelps, he was a banker, and he had an office in his room in the Whatcom Hotel. And then in 1883, when that was built, he moved the office over there. And then later on, the post office was in that building. So here's your population of Whatcom. Then there was a no man's land across the mouth of the creek, and then you had Seaholm. In 1891, they both joined to become New Whatcom. Here's the mouth of the creek. You've got the Colony Mill, and the water's coming down along in here, running through the falls, and then coming out on the other, just about in here. And the mill, by this time, had grown quite a bit large. This is 1885 to 89, somewhere in there. And the Indians are still coming in here. They're going to walk up the hill and go out to the field, the hops fields that were north of town, and pick hops. Washington was the biggest hops producer, and I believe it still is in the United States. In 1890s, they got the aphids into the hops, and down there wiped out the whole crop. And so it took a few years to restore that, but if you go to eastern Washington, you'll see them everywhere. So what else in this picture? Here's the Reveille. The Bellingham Bay Reveille was a newspaper that started back in 1883, and it went till about 1911, 1912. Here's C Street. Now, it doesn't go through anymore because this all disintegrated or burned down or whatever in the next few years. And so it was built on pilings. And of course, that eventually, it was never replaced after it rotted and fell apart. Here's the front of the mill. Here's the site of the old mill here. Actually, a road came down here, come into the mill. The logs would go up this ramp, be chopped into, or cut into boards and whatnot. There's nothing up here except for this little building here. Now, this is that office that was in that newspaper clipping. It's still up there. It's being rented out, and people are living in it. This is the building in 1889. Now, original pictures say 1888. However, the reason that I know it's 1889 is because the 1888 picture that is also in existence has all of the steel shutters on these doors, and here there's only one left. It's the 1858 brick building. It's the oldest brick building in Washington State. In fact, all the way back east to Kenosha County, Wisconsin, and all of Canada east to Ontario. And then, of course, there was a couple that are older in Portland area, and then you go to California for the next ones, which are about 500 of. It was built by Hyatt and Richards, two partners who ran a general store here, and he wanted it to build it for as a warehouse and a repository for the gold that was going to come back into Whatcom from the gold rush in 1858, which never happened. I mean, the only saving thing in here was a Western Union Telegraph office, and they dealt with cash. There were no banks here or anything like that. So this is 1888. It's spending its last year as the county courthouse. They're already started to move out because the building, this is when they're restoring the building, basically. They did the first restoration, got everything back together, and the district court was being held upstairs at this time. Before that, the judges wouldn't be in the building because of the dangers of falling brick and whatnot. And then, of course, later that year, they're going to start renting it to the JAR people. There's still officers in the building. The last one doesn't leave until August of 1889, moving into the new courthouse, which was over on G Street. This was an insurance company map, and they drew everything, and then they talked about what the building was made out of, if it was wood or brick or stone, what it was used for. So here's the Whatcom Hotel, and here's the courthouse, and the walkways, the wooden walkways, and then if you notice, it was just a flat roof, soldered tin roof. Here it is in 1893. It's got a pitch roof. You can tell by the lines. So that tells us the date that the roof was within that 2-year period, or 3. Center Street, that was vacated, and that property was turned over to all the people that had property around it, of which the courthouse has part of that. See, at that time it's called the WRC Hall because they were renting the building before they purchased it. Here's a picture of it right after it's the Women's Auxiliary Corps for the Auxiliary Relief Corps for the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, Civil War veterans. The last one died in 26 or so, and so I don't think the thing lasted much longer than that. Then it became a insurance fraternity organization, and then after that it belonged to the Masonic Lodge, which went by a different name, the Junior Order of Mechanics. Then it was a Jehovah's Witness church. Then it was a pottery studio. It was an outdoor sporting goods store. It was a general store. It was an underground location for the Vietnam people who were going to Canada, who were fighting anti-war people. Now it's ours. Here's the new courthouse, it was 1890. It was built out of sandstone covering timbering. So the clock, there again, they ran out of money, don't have a clock, just a piece of wood. Just like this building, ran out of money, didn't put a clock in, just painted a clock on the board. This was built out of sandstone from the Seaholm Quarry, which was up above Old Main, up on the hill above Old Main. And Roeder, who owned the Chuckanut Quarry on Chuckanut Bay, he was a little put out about it because he thought he was Mr. They let him build the little sandstone wall around it, gave him something. So by 1940, the tower's gone, which isn't surprising because most of the county buildings at that period of time deteriorated to the point where something had to be taken off. It got so bad in that tower that they evacuated the building. The fire department came in and said, you can't be in here. And so they had to take the tower off, then they could put their workers back in the building. It was torn down in 55. It was sold to Ole Johnson and his sons for the grand total price of $75, and his lawyer lent him the money. It took them 2 years to tear it down because they were fishermen, and then they did this during the off season. This is Holly Street in 1888. There's no street. It ends where the guy's standing, and it picks up again on the other side of the Colony Dock. There's a story here about the Fairhaven people bought the Colony Dock, or Colony Mill, and then they parked a barge right here, and they wouldn't let any road work be done because they wanted the train depot, and instead Whatcom was going to get the train depot. So in the middle of the night, the Whatcom guys, they went out and they cut the barge loose and shoved it out of the way, and by that morning had the pilings driven. This is a picture a year later. The railroad came, 1891. This is 1889, the fall. This is the Bellingham Hotel. It's being built, and then it's later on going to be Purdy's Opera House attached to it. It was quite the thing here in those days. And that was the first of a couple of Bellingham hotels. The other one was over in the little town of Bellingham, which had been sold to the Bennett people by that time, and it was part of Fairhaven. The town of Bellingham was platted in 1873, and it survived. It was Edward Eldridge. He was a partner in that, along with some of the people in Seattle, the big business people down there. And it never made it. It never did well. 73 was a bad year for stuff all over the world. They had a depression in Europe. We had a war, so there was no money available to build stuff. And so the town kind of went. It just had a few houses, maybe a dozen houses in the hotel. So they're planking Holly Street. Everything west of F Street is planked in this area. The streets and sidewalks and everything on pilings. And then, of course, some of that was still here when we moved here in 71. There were a couple of buildings still left. This is Fairhaven about the same time. They started building the Fairhaven Hotel, and it finished in early 1892, just in time for the next depression to hit. By 1904, the hotel was for sale. And that was about the time that it changed hands and became the Hotel Victoria. The streets, nice note in the paper about the salesman selling lots while they were wading through the muddy streets. You can see what they're doing is all this lumber is going to be laid down as a street. And they did it all over town, all over Fairhaven and Whatcom, up on the boulevard. All the main streets in town were made out of cedar planks. They had lots of trees. They just used the wood. It wasn't until about 1908 that they started using paving materials like asphalt. It's concrete. Here's the Fairhaven Hotel. This is on its opening day, big ceremony, parade, and whatnot. Larrabee was one of the financiers in this building. He was a teetotaler. He would not allow any liquor to be sold in this building. And so it didn't do well. He lived in it, and I think he died before his house was built down in the Larrabee Manor. So anyhow, here it is in 1920. The steeple's gone, the tower. Let's see what happened. Oh yeah, rotten timbers. But you notice it's got nice pavement there on them. They use bricks for the trolley lines in between the rails. This is looking south on State Street. This is Holly here. This is J.C. Lighthouse's block. It wasn't called the Lighthouse Block because of the tower. It was his name. He was a financier from Chicago, and he built this building for $50,000. It had a ballroom on the top floor. Behind it is the Byron Hotel, which then became later on the Leopold Hotel. This is the Beck Hotel, his hotel here, and his Beck's Theater. And it was the largest theater in Northwest Washington. It was huge, 2,200 seats in it. It had 3 levels of balconies. They played Ben-Hur in this theater with a live team of horses and chariot. They ran on a treadmill. It was quite the palace. He never made any money on it, and so by 1912 it was sold and became the Metropolitan Theater, and then a couple of years later that sold and became the American Theater. Some of you probably saw movies in this. Then later on it became J.C. Penney's. In 1903 they took the railroad that used to run out past Lake Sammamish on the old Sammamish Highway. They moved the tracks inland, or out along the water. The Great Northern did, and so they came into town along the coast there, Chuckanut Bay, swung across the north end of Bay, through the Edgemore Point there, and then came along the waterfront. So they're driving the tunnel. 1903. The car barn on Kentucky Street. This was a horse stable back in the 70s. So I don't know if you remember that. It was the trolley barn. This is where the city trolleys cars were built and maintained. It was also, you can see the stack on the backside, was where they had a power plant back there that they used to electrify the trolley tracks, or the lines. And so that was the first power plant for most of the city, and it was used to run the trolleys. The Bellingham Bay Improvement Company mill, where GP sat, that was another power plant there. This was DC power, by the way, and they used its arc lamps. Now, those were quite the thing back then. And then in 1902 or 1904, they started up the Nooksack Falls power plant, and that supplied power for all the city. That was 4,000 megawatts or something. I mean, or four megawatts, something like that. Pretty small, but the city wasn't that big. So then they built the one on Ellis. There was a power plant there until they got Bonneville Power. Here's the town of Excelsior, and there's the Nooksack Falls power plant. The first bridge across the Nooksack River used to come up this side of the river and cross over here to go up to Glacier and whatnot. PAF Fishery, biggest fishing company or fish processing plant in the world, 1905. These are scows. They're loaded with salmon, 50,000 salmon in each one off of the salmon traps all over Puget Sound. This is what it looks like when you have 150,000 salmon on the floor of the processing plant. When they got done, they shoved all the leftovers out back into the bay through the doors. We probably had the largest population of mud sharks in the world. And it stunk. You can imagine, summertime, you got this black smoke pouring off all the sawmills. You got the fish canneries here, and they're dumping garbage all over the edges of the water. 1908, May 21st, 22nd, greatest event in the history of the town. The Great White Fleet, 7 battleships and 1 hospital ship show up here for 2 days of entertainment, and what a party that was. They had approximately 100,000 visitors here in this city with a population of 25,000. Comparison here today would be 400,000 people showing up for a weekend. Here's the parade. They're coming north on State Street. They're coming off the top of the hill back down onto the level. And they're marching. They're going to march all the way to Ellis, turn around and come back, and then go down Holly to G Street, and then turn around and then come back and back up this hill where they're done dispersed for the activities for the day. 6,500 men, sailors and Marines marching. So they went down, turned around, and came back. This is a Marine contingent. I just thought I'd throw this in. This is supposed to be in Bellingham Bay, but I don't know for sure. It's a monitor. They had these started building them, of course, in the Civil War. They used it up until about 1920. One of these, Admiral Dewey, when he attacked Manila, drove the Spanish out. The German Navy was there waiting for him to make a mistake. He had just a couple of ships. So this was the West Coast Navy fleet, these ships. Now, one of these went across from LA all the way over to Manila Bay. The sailors on it said the whole time they were at sea, the decks were awash. That's only 6 feet. And so when they got over there, they couldn't bring it back. The sailors refused to sail. So they sold it to one of the governments over there. Construction of the interurban line, south of Bellingham, in 1912. This was quite the project here because of all the rock removal and other stuff that went on with this line. It cost $1 million a mile in 1912 to build. It was the second most expensive road in Washington State. It's just a railroad. Here they're at Clayton Bay driving pilings. They're coming down off the hill. They had to build wooden bridge over the top of the GN line. They couldn't use a GN line. And then they also built one over the road that's up by the entrance to Larrabee Park. So then they came down here, and there wasn't any room to build next to the railroad. So what they did was they went to sea. This is the trolley that went to sea. That's what they called it. So they're driving pilings all across the bay. The only problem that they never figured out before it was too late was that teredo worms would attack the pilings. So here they bought a grouter machine, put it on a railroad car, and pumped the grout, covered the pilings with it. If you go on a low tide, you can go out and see these pilings, and you'll still see the concrete coating on some of them. It quit in 1930, went out of business. The automobiles were just a fad. This is the one that's in the bushes up on the hill behind Mount Vernon. A friend of mine in Mount Vernon, he found this. He was going to drag it into a shop somewhere. Anyhow, we went up to look at it. And
what is it, Wes?
It's a trolley car. Yeah. It was made into a little shack, a house. So it went in, there was a sink and whatnot installed, and on the other end there was a living room and table. And this is what it would have looked like. And this is number 216, and this is number 219. You can see the number 219. He was going to restore it, but boy, I would like to have the one that was in the spaghetti factory in Seattle. Okay. Bellingham, 1938, they did an aerial survey of all the cities. The government did. Here's Bellingham. A lot of differences in this picture. We'll go, here's the old Citizens Dock. That's not there anymore. There's the creek comes down here. The Colony Mill, it's not there anymore. The Stenger House, he owned the mill. That's not there anymore. I mean, we could go on and on. Here's Puget Sound Pulp. There's no Roeder Avenue. This is Roeder Avenue. It just came right off. This is the east half of the picture. So you've got a lot of buildings there. The primary location here for my talk is right here was the original coal mine. The Seaholm coal mine entry was right in here. Later on, they moved it up to here and then went over here. 3 openings. They drove tunnels all the way under the federal building where it sits today in 3 different layers of coal. One of them was about 11 feet deep or wide, and the other 2 were a little bit smaller. They mined about $100,000 worth of coal in the 1860s and 70s. And it closed in 78, and it continually had fires in it, and they had to flood the mine sometimes 3 times a year. The reason for that was because the coal had sulfur in it, and it would auto-ignite if they left any debris laying anywhere in the mine. They had to continually sweep out the mine. 1950s, Oldie Johnson sat up there on Seaholm Hill taking pictures, slide pictures. This is one of the booms. I mean, the bay, you had an opening going into the mouth of the creek, and that was it. Everything else was covered with timber for the Whatcom Falls Mill and the Lodell Mill. Here's another picture, bringing in, those tanks were the Standard Oil Company tanks on the, out along the end of Hilton Harbor there. And you can see in the background, just nothing but logs. 1905, they had to cut 200,000 old growth cedars and fir a year to feed the mills here. The end. This is one of the photographers in town. He was here through the 60s. Is Sanderson, Wilbur Sanderson. He took pictures clear back in 1908 of the Great White Fleet here. And so this is his son. You couldn't do that today. People would turn you in. Anyhow, that's for tonight.
Where was Fort Bellingham?
Fort Bellingham was about 3 miles west of the creek, and it sat right on the bluff, and there's a nursery there now. It was burned, the last remnants of the fort were burned in the 1890s, and pretty much nothing left. There's still some Chuckanut sandstone walkway there or something. That's about it. Okay?
You mentioned that the roof on the courthouse was a flat soldered roof, and I noticed in the slide it looked like a gable trussed roof. Was that changed due to fire or something? Or?
No, it just finally, it got so many leaks they had to cover it up. It was,
Yeah.
They cut holes in it. They had a stairway that went up into the attic later, but they had a skylight in there for light, and of course it leaked constantly, and the floors were, getting damaged and things like that. So that was part of the major repair they did. They just put another roof on top. The tin roof is still on the building, just full of holes. Okay, next.
Where was the car barn on Kentucky?
On Kentucky Street.
But where on Kentucky?
What's the side street, Kent?
It was out past Pacific Street.
Okay.
I'm interested in that picture of the mill with the shed in the background.
After the old mill
Is
burned.
it? Yeah, okay. Now that shed, I believe, is the longhouse owned by Clara Tennant's father, Salik, one of the leaders of the Lummi. He had a longhouse there that housed the Lummi when they were fishing at the creek, and then it began to be used for the Lummies who were working at the mill. Tim Wall is the first one that figured this out, but he's not sure how old the longhouse was there. There were 3 longhouses around the bay in town, which doesn't usually get recognized, but that's the first time I've ever seen anything that might be it. Too bad I didn't get it before I wrote Clara Tennant's biography.
Anyone else? Well, thank you.